Hi everyone, my name is Gurjat Basra and I'm the Manager of Patient Programs, Research and Advocacy at Lymphoma Canada. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the last session of the day titled Accessing Clinical Trials in Canada. So to introduce our speaker, today we have here Dawn Richards, who is the founder of 502 Labs and Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. She has a PhD from the University of Alberta and experience in a variety of roles over the past 20 years. However, in her role at Clinical Trials Ontario, Dawn is charged with executing on CTO's strategic pillar of patient and public engagement. So thank you, Dawn, for joining us today, and you can get started as soon as you're ready.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Gurjot, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's really my privilege to join you. I'm going to give you some basic information about clinical trials. I'm going to help you if you're interested in finding a clinical trial. And then we're going to wrap things up with talking about sort of what your rights as a participant are if you've decided to be in a clinical trial. As Gurjot said, I am part of an organization called Clinical Trials Ontario. And really, the vision of CTO, which you might hear me call it, is to help Ontario a better place, to help make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. We are primarily supported by the Government of Ontario to do that. And we've got three strategic priorities here. One is to help streamline the processes related to doing clinical trials. The second is the engage pillar, which I'm going to talk to you about today, where we engage both patients as partners in our work at CTO and where we engage patients in the public to help them make their own personal informed decisions about participating in clinical trials. And third, we also promote Ontario as a place to do clinical trials. So while I'm part of an Ontario-based organization, what I'm going to share with you today is really applicable to any place in Canada because clinical trials are regulated at a national level by Health Canada. So anything you hear me talk about today, doesn't matter what province you're in, it's going to be the same for you in that province. And quite frankly, globally, a lot of how clinical trials are the same as well, but there can be some nuances in regulation. Secondly, everything that I talk to you about here can be found on our website, the Learn More About Clinical Trials section. So the URL is there or the QR code is there for you to scan. And all of this has been developed with our patient and public partners. So as I mentioned, they work with me in most of what I do at CTO. And so they've helped me develop a lot of the context that's in these slides. So let's start with the basics about clinical trials. What are clinical trials to start off with? It's important to know that clinical trials are research, and they're a type of research that involves people. They test what we call health-related interventions. Intervention is a different way to say treatment or therapy, and they test the outcomes related to those treatments and therapies. And they're designed really specifically to answer questions like, is the therapy safe? Does it improve or cure disease? Or does it help people live longer with that disease? Does it help their quality of life? Does it help them feel better? So you'll see as I talk how different phases of trials are designed differently to answer different questions. And while we often think about clinical trials being done for drugs, different health interventions can actually be studied using clinical trials. And you might be looking at one health intervention on its own, or you might be comparing a couple to each other or in combination. So they can look and feel different. So drugs are one thing that we can study using clinical trials. Devices might be another thing, like, for example, a pacemaker or maybe some kind of digital app. A surgery can be something we look at in clinical trials, radiation therapy, maybe a diagnostic procedure like an imaging procedure or some other type of procedure. And even things like diet and lifestyle can be studied through clinical trials. So why do we even do clinical trials? Well, as I mentioned before, they are a type of research and they provide us with data, which you might hear called evidence, about the treatment or the intervention that's being tested. And what that data does is it helps a number of different people decide about what therapies or other interventions might work best for people. And a whole bunch of different people can actually use the evidence from clinical trials to make decisions. So you might think, well, the people doing the clinical trial would probably make a decision about, if the clinical trial continues on to another phase based on that evidence. Healthcare providers look at clinical trial data to see how they might best treat their patients. Clinical trial data is also used by healthcare providers and professionals to develop what's called treatment guidelines. Policymakers or decision makers make choices about what therapies might become available or what might be covered on what's called formularies. Health Canada makes decisions based on the evidence of clinical trials. And even right down to you and I, we might make choices based on the evidence that we read maybe in a research publication or based on what we talk about with maybe a physician or nurse that is treating us, et cetera. So lots of different people use the evidence that clinical trials generate to make everyday treatment decisions and choices, quite honestly. So you may remember me saying clinical trials aren't only used to test drugs, but that might be the simplest way for us to talk about them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through these different phases of clinical trials that we're going to decide a hypothetical drug of ours is going to go on this journey through. And it's a nice way for me to break down for you how different phases for clinical trials are designed, the types of questions they answer, the size of the trial, all those kinds of fun things. So here we go. Let's talk about phase 1 clinical trials for drugs. So these types of trials are also called first in human because that's the first time in the case for our drug that it would go into people. And so sometimes you might get a little bit scared by this, but I want to tell you that while this is still research, like we've talked about, often for many years, a drug is studied outside of people before it's kind of gated to be tried in people per se. So there's all kinds of people on the so-called discovery side of science or the basic side of science before a drug would get into a person to be tested, who would find out all kinds of things about maybe what's called the mechanism of action of the drug. So how does the drug actually work? And we might look at properties of the drug too in terms of how it might be absorbed by people. And we would do that maybe using cells, or we might also do that by looking at what happens to the drug when you mix it with plasma or blood. And we might also do animal studies. And based on that whole big pile of research and evidence, that would all go into making a decision about whether or not this drug could potentially be used in people. So first in humans. So usually many, many years of testing this drug outside of people. So we have a good sense of what it should do in people, but we don't actually know until it goes into people. These participants are really closely monitored because it is the first time that this drug is being used by people. And we're looking here about the safety of the drug. So is it safe for people to use? What should the dose be in people? Again, we should have a good understanding of that before it gets into people, but that will be massaged. And what are the side effects of this drug in people? So sometimes these people go to an actual site where they will be really closely monitored for a number of days. usually really a small number of people. And usually these individuals don't live with the condition that's being studied. Sometimes they are, but that's sometimes where you hear people in phase 1 studies are called healthy control. So they're people that don't live with the condition that's under study for this drug. So we're going to assume that our drug has established that it's safe to be in people. We're learning about the dose. We're learning about the side effects that maybe we knew were potential side effects to start off with, but they hadn't been tested in humans yet. And we've decided we've got the funding to keep this drug going to the next phase, which would be phase 2 for our drug. So small number of participants, which you talked about. For phase 2 studies, our drug would now go into a larger number of participants. These participants generally have the condition for which the drug is intended, slightly larger number of people. And here we're looking at what's called efficacy. So does the drug do what it's supposed to do in people with a condition that it's supposed to be useful for? And throughout the different phases of clinical trials, we'll continue to learn more about dose and we'll continue to learn more about side effects. Really important to note that even if something meets its so-called endpoints in one of these phases, for a number of different reasons, the drug may or may not continue through the different phases of clinical trials. Larger number of participants in phase 2, sometimes it takes a little bit more time as well. So we're going to keep on with the story that our hypothetical drug has met its phase 2 endpoints. We've got funding to take the drug into what's called phase 3 clinical trials. Phase 3 oftentimes will be in larger numbers of people. And again, this is really going to depend on like what the condition is that's being studied. Sometimes for rare diseases, some of the phases of clinical trials will be combined, et cetera. But this is a good guide as we walk through it. So we're going into phase 3 study with our drug. Here we're looking to see, because we know it does what it's supposed to do, we know that it's safe, and now we want to look at how long the effects of our drug lasts. And as we continue to put this drug into more people, we're understanding more about dose and more about the side effects. So generally a larger number of participants for phase 3 studies. And sometimes you might hear the phrase RCT or randomized clinical trial. And that's when we're testing 2 or more interventions or treatment arms against each other. So those would be phase 3 trials. So we might be testing our drug about what is already used as the standard of care and doing a comparison with those. Randomization is an approach where the people in the trial, so in this phase of the trial, are assigned by chance to one of the interventions. And we do that to reduce bias so that when we look at the data, we don't know who's been given what, and the data are, quote, cleaner that way. So we're going to assume now that our drug is looking good for its phase 3 endpoints, and this would be where we could apply to Health Canada for our drug to be approved and to be then widely used by people in Canada. Phase 4 studies aren't always done. So after phase 3 studies, the sponsors, as I mentioned, can apply to help Health Canada approve, in our case, our drug to make it widely available. If we did a phase 4 clinical trial, this would be once it's been approved by Health Canada, and now if we're in a disease area where tens of thousands of people have the condition we're studying, then we can start to see effects in even larger numbers of people. And so this is sometimes called post-marketing surveillance study because it's being done after it's being approved to be marketed widely. And here we're looking at long-term side effects, and we're also looking at sometimes there are safety signals that happen in a really large number of people that weren't otherwise observed in the trials themselves. So very, very large or much larger number of participants in these phase 4 studies. Sometimes I get asked about placebo. And so what is a placebo? A placebo is actually an inactive therapy that looks exactly like the active therapy. So if it's a white pill, it would look identical to the active therapy. It would look like a white pill. It would be the same shape, the same size. It would weigh the same. It would be taken the same way. But it's really not intended to have any effect on the condition that's being studied. And just like randomization, that's why we use placebos. They're used to make the results of the study more reliable, or they're used to decrease the bias in the results. And it's really important to note that if there's already a standard of care that's available for a condition or a disease, a placebo would not be used. Instead, the intervention that's being studied would be compared to the standard of care for that disease. So it wouldn't be ethical for a placebo to be used in that case. So those are a bit about the basics of clinical trials, like what the different phases look like, how they're designed to answer different questions, different types of therapies that can be studied in trials, who uses the evidence of trials as well. So you might be interested yourself in finding a clinical trial. And so what does that look like if that's of interest to you? Well, you might talk to your healthcare provider. Sometimes they're pretty in the know about trials that are available. You might reach out to Gurjot and her colleagues at Lymphoma Canada. They're usually pretty in the know as well. If you live close to a hospital or a research organization that you know does trials, you might reach out to them. You can hear about legitimate trials in the newspaper, TV, and radio ads. Sometimes those are phase 1 studies that are looking for participants. And I've also included a QR code for our own clinical trial finder, which actually looks at a database called clinicaltrials.gov, which is a very large global database. It's not completely comprehensive, though. And we've got search functions so you can just look at the condition you're interested in, which province or territory in Canada or all of Canada that you're interested in. We just made it a little bit easier for you to navigate that database. So you're really the only person that can decide if a trial is right for you and if you think that it's reputable or credible. But here's some things you might look out for if you're looking to find a trial. So one of the things to look out for is that the cost to participate in the clinical trial should be mostly covered. So you should not be charged thousands of dollars to access this study treatment. You might have to pay for parking, or you might have to take some time off work. Maybe you have to cover some meals at the site. But really, the study treatment should be provided as part of the study, and that should be a really red flag if you're asked to pay for that. You can look at the qualifications of the trial team. Often, these are people who've worked in a specific area for a really long time. They might be academic researchers that have pretty extensive publication record in this area, or they might be well known in that area. The clinical trial application has to have been reviewed by a regulatory agency. So in Canada, that's Health Canada. Sometimes there are also trials that happen here that the FDA has oversight on, but anything happening in Canada has to be approved by Health Canada. The clinical trial will have been reviewed and approved by what's called a research ethics board or an REB. And then the institution where the trial is happening, takes on a certain liability, and they're responsible for that trial. So they will have reviewed and approved that clinical trial as well. And really asking about any and all of these questions in a reputable or credible clinical trial should not cause any pause from the study team. They should be more than happy to answer these types of questions for you. And so if you find a trial where you're thinking, I'm good with this, I can see that Health Canada has approved it, I can see a research ethics board has approved it, then your decision becomes, is that a good clinical trial for you? And one of the things that's important to know is down here at the bottom that even if you're interested in a trial, you have to meet what's called the eligibility criteria to be in a trial. That's kind of like a list of things that you need to have to qualify for the clinical trial. So maybe you have to be living with a certain condition. Maybe you have to be within so far of a study site. Maybe you have to be a certain age. Those are things that you would go through with the study team if you're really interested. That would be part of what's called a screening before you're invited to participate and make a decision about participating in the clinical trial. I'm often asked, like, what kinds of questions should I ask if I found a clinical trial that I meet the eligibility criteria for? There's kind of a big list here, and I'm happy to send these later on, or they're also on the CTO website. So this is the first kind of list, making sure that you're actually eligible. You probably want to know like who the study physician is. You might want to know who's funding it, what the team's credentials are. You might really be interested in the procedures involved. So, like, what do you have to do to be in the trial? How often, maybe, do you have to go in? What kinds of tests will be administered and what do those look like, or treatments? How long will appointments be? Do you have to fill out diaries, questionnaires, surveys? Will you see your own doctor still? If you're worried about receiving the placebo, is that something you want to ask about? And potential benefits and risks. And those might not just be ones where you're in the trial, but those might be long-lasting ones as well, such as reproductive risks. Those are important questions to ask. There might be other questions that you ask too, like when does it start and how long will it last? How many other people will be in it? What will I actually have to pay for out of pocket? Will I need to travel? And what does that look like? And will some of that be covered or will all of that be covered? Basically, how will this affect my life, right? Is this just going to affect me? Is it going to affect my family? What are the other choices if I don't participate? Who are my key contacts? What happens if I want to leave before it's finished? And if the treatment was beneficial for you, can you actually stay on it after the trial? And maybe when the trial is close to being done, there might be even some short or long-term follow-up. And so what do those things look like? So as you start to work your way in closer to seeing if you're eligible or if you're interested in a trial, these might be some of the things that concern you. Seeing how it's really going to impact you overall, what the time frame looks like, any and all questions you have really are open game for you to ask the trial team. These are just some ideas that we presented for you. There are other options if you decide not to be in a clinical trial. Maybe it's receiving no treatment. Maybe it's receiving a standard treatment or something different from the treatment that you're currently on. Maybe it's not even participating in a clinical trial, but maybe it's some other type of research study. We've got here that you should consider talking to your doctor about potential known benefits and risks of all these options, including no treatment. But maybe there are other trusted healthcare providers and even family members, friends as well, that you might be having these conversations with. And if you can't find a trial that's near to you, you might contact the study team and see if you can still participate in the study at the location it's at. Maybe that's a possibility. Maybe that means you have to do a bit of travel. Maybe that can be covered by the actual trial. So those are things to ask. Don't think that just because it's not, down the street from you, you can't participate. Or maybe there are ways to bring the clinical trial closer to you. That might take a bit of work, but I have heard stories of people doing that, especially when they've advocated for their kids to be in trials. And the other thing to do is to keep up to date on research. So sometimes with new and emerging trials, they will open in other global centers first, and then they will come to Canada. And I certainly know instances where people have done that. They've just held tight for a little bit, and the research has come, and they've been able to participate in Canada in that research. It's important to know too that even if your healthcare provider offers you a clinical trial, if you don't think that's the right choice for you, you don't have to say yes to it. And that should not affect the quality of the care that you receive. So that's your personal decision to participate in research or not, and really should not impact your medical care. So let's talk a bit about your kind of rights and responsibilities in terms of participating or withdrawing from a clinical trial. One of the things you may have heard about is this concept of informed consent. And I think we often think of informed consent as a form that you sign to say that you'd like to participate in the trial. But it's more than a form, it's actually a process. And the form is part of that process. And it's important to know that you deciding to participate in a trial is voluntary and that you can withdraw that consent at any time for any reason. And you can ask all along the way when you are participating in a trial, any kinds of questions to make sure that you are informed as you participate in that study. If you decide to withdraw consent, so if you decide to leave the study, you can also request that any data you provided or any biological materials you provided also be removed from the study. That may or may not be possible, but if that's something that's important to you, you for sure can ask, and you can find the reasons why that may or may not be possible. All trials will have potential benefits and risks. And I've talked a little bit about how this is a personal decision for you to participate because you need to decide if you feel that the potential benefits outweigh the potential risks for you to participate in the study. They'll be different for each clinical trial, and they will be described in the informed consent form. And you should really ask any and all questions you have about those. Not just about those, but about the trial generally until you feel satisfied that you can make a decision. If you do decide to leave a clinical trial, that's called withdrawal. You don't need to leave any kind of reason or provide any kind of reason to the trial team if you make that decision. You are encouraged to talk to the study team about that decision. That might help you actually make the decision, for one. And that might also help you understand what you need to do to safely leave the study. And so you might have to have some tests done or some physical exams done. And you might even be asked some questions about your experience of being in the trial. Again, we talked about the fact that you may decide to ask for any data you provided or any samples you provided to be withdrawn as well, which may or may not be possible. But again, you can certainly ask that if that's what you'd like to do. So I'm going to leave it at that. Again, I would encourage you, if you would like to learn more, to please visit our website. The QR code is there. The URL is there. I can be sure to provide it as well. There's a lot more detail on the web pages about what I've talked about, plus some other questions that we've answered for you. And there's also a little bit more about some of the questions you might want to ask. And I know I kind of blasted through that, so I apologize for that. But happy for you to check out the website, and there might be some more questions there for you as well. I'll leave it at that. I'd really like to thank you for participating today and for listening to me. I'm sorry I can't be with you. My email address is here, and I'm really happy if you would like to contact me after the fact. I'm happy to answer any questions for you or help you out with anything that I presented today that wasn't quite clear for you. So thanks very much, and back to you, Gurjot.
Thank you, Dawn, for that very informative presentation on the basis of clinical trials and for sharing the contact information as well. I want to now take the time to direct the audience to attend the closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.